Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome back to part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 10, Sustaining Terrestrial Biodiversity, Forests, Public Lands, Grasslands, Wetlands, and Cities. All right, so once again, remember there are about 90 slides or so to this presentation, so this is going to be a three-parter, all right? And once again, this is part 2. So moving on from where we left off with part 1, we are now heading off to reducing tropical deforestation. So some ways that we can try to reduce that tropical deforestation is depth for nature swaps and conservation concessions. Basically, we protect forests in return for aid. So again, what we're talking about here, most of our tropical rainforest or tropical deforestation in those tropical rainforests are occurring in third world countries. So if we can provide them with some money, right, or some aid in return for protecting those tropical forests, then maybe we can reduce the amount of forests that are being taken down in these tropical regions. We can crack down on illegal logging in tropical forests. We can end government subsidies for logging roads. We can purchase only sustainable produced wood. Again, we talked about that previously, how only buy wood that has been certified that it was produced sustainably, and plant forests on degraded land to hopefully grow those forests back up. So once again, we have one of these, one of our charts here. Once again, I would know some prevention, some restoration ideas here so that you can use them on an FRQ or any multiple choice question. So again, sustaining tropical forests, prevention, protect the most diverse and endangered areas, educate settlers about sustainable agricultural and forestry, and we're going to have a whole unit on that coming up in a couple of weeks. Subsidize only sustainable forest use. Again, only give aid if they are using the forest sustainably. Protect forests through depth for nature swaps and conservation concessions like we spoke about before. Certify sustainably grown timber and reduce poverty and slow population growth, which again could mitigate many of these problems as well. What can we do to restore forests that have been taken down? Well, encourage regrowth through secondary succession, rehabilitate degraded areas, and concentrate farming and ranching in already cleared areas. So don't clear more to farm and ranch. Find areas that are naturally cleared and use them for your farming and your ranching. Okay, moving on now, we'll talk about grasslands. So again, that was on forests. We spoke about forests a lot in the first part 1. That was kind of the end of the forest now, talking about the tropical forest. Now we're going to move on to those grasslands. So methods to sustain the productivity of grasslands. We have to control the numbers and distribution of grazing livestock. That really is the biggest issue when it comes to grasslands, that they are being overgrazed by livestock, and we need to control that. We also need to restore degraded grasslands. So some terms for you. Again, some rangelands are overgrazed. What is a rangeland? Well, a rangeland is an unfenced grassland in temperate and tropical climates that supply forage for animals. What's a pasture? A pasture is a managed grassland or fenced-in meadow used for grazing livestock. So again, there are two. Pastures, again, are going to be fenced in. They're going to be managed. Rangelands are just kind of nature, right? Unfenced areas that animals are allowed to forage. So a moderate level of grazing is healthy for grasslands. However, as is always the case, overgrazing of our rangelands and our grasslands is not going to be good because it reduces the grass cover, it compacts the soil, which lessens the capacity to hold water. It leads to erosion of the soil by water and wind. Again, we spoke about in the forest, when you take trees away right from the ground, the roots hold in the soil. So when you take those trees out, nothing holds the soil. So when it rains, all that soil washes away. Well, the same thing with grasslands, right? The roots of the grass hold in the soil. So once you overgraze these rangelands, these grasslands, now you have nothing to hold the topsoil in. So that erodes the topsoil. Again, it allows it to hold less water. And so now it's harder to get more grass to grow, right? It's harder to rejuvenate that grassland or that rangeland. And it promotes invasion of plant species that cattle won't eat, right? So now you have plant species that can come in, they can They can prosper because the other grasslands and stuff, the grasses aren't around anymore, but the cattle won't eat this. And so now you have an area that can't be used anymore by anybody. So here's a picture, a really stark picture that really kind of tells the tale. You'll notice left of the fence here in this picture. So here's this fence. Over here is overgrazed rangeland. Okay. To the right of the fence is lightly grazed rangeland. And you can see the difference. Look at the difference. Here you still have all this grass here, right? Holding the soil, producing biodiversity. Here, even though you have a little grass here or there, you're left with a lot of windswept soil that is pretty much useless because the topsoil has been eroded away. So again, a really stark contrast here between overgrazing on the left of the fence and not overgrazing on the right. And obviously, we want to do more of what's happening on the right side of that fence rather than what's happening on the left side. So in order to do that, we need to manage our rangelands more sustainably. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do something called rotational grazing. You've probably heard of crop rotation, right? And we'll talk about that more in a couple of chapters. Crop rotation is you take different crops and grow them in different fields in different years. Same thing with rotational grazing. Move the cattle around regularly so they're not overgrazing the same area. They do a little bit of grazing here, a little bit of grazing here, a little bit of grazing here. Okay, and as a result, you can sustain your rangelands a bit more. Fence off the damaged areas and allow secondary succession to take hold, right? If you fence off what's damaged, don't allow any cattle, any ATVs, road, cars or truck, things like that on it. Secondary succession will take over, and eventually that rangeland will prosper again, okay? So fence off that damaged area. Do holistic herd management. This is a short-term trampling by moving herd actually aerates the soil. It's actually a good thing. Increases nutrient recycling and soil fertility by pressing decaying grasses into the soil. So again, some grazing is necessary and can actually help our rangelands and our grasslands. And again, short-term trampling aerates the soil and actually helps grow more grasses. So again, we don't necessarily want to stop grazing altogether. We just want to slow it down and again, move it around so that we're not grazing in the same location constantly every single time. And again, here's a picture that really tells the story. On the left side, this was the mid-1980s. This is a stream along the banks of the San Pedro River in Arizona. And you'll notice on the left here side, the cattle have been overgrazing there for years, and they totally degraded the river system or the banks of that river. Now look at on the right here. Within 10 years, okay, what they did was they realized that this river here had a degraded stream bank. They fenced it off, did not allow any road vehicles or any grazing on it. And within 10 years, look at what happened. This is basically the same spot right here on the right. Within 10 years, secondary succession took over and restored this area. So again, another positive. Nature does take care of itself, right? If we can just provide it with what it needs. In this case, nature needed to not be grazed or not be run on by off-road vehicles, right? So we ban that, and within 10 years, secondary succession takes over, and here we go now. This area, this riverbank here is now restored, right? And so now you could bring some cattle in there again. Just don't overgraze, right? Bring them in a little at a time, move them somewhere else, make sure that you are grazing in a sustainable way. Okay, moving on now to wetlands. How can we manage and sustain our wetlands? Well, we've been talking about this for many chapters in this course. Wetlands are disappearing. The United States has lost more than half of its coastal and inland wetlands since 1900. Other countries have lost even more. And the rate of loss of wetlands through the world is actually accelerating. It's not decelerating. So for centuries, people have drained, filled in, or covered over swamps, marshes, and other wetlands for certain activities. Number one, to create rice fields or other cropland. Again, we spoke about this. This is also what's happening a lot in tropical forests, right? We talked about how our third world countries, they need their food, right? They should be allowed to feed their children. So not only are they cutting down the tropical forest, but they're draining the wetlands to create rice fields and other land for crops to grow. Wetlands are being drained in or drained or filled in or covered over to accommodate expanding cities and suburbs. They're disappearing to build roads, to extract minerals, oil, and natural gas, and to eliminate breeding grounds for insects that cause diseases such as malaria, right? Malaria, obviously, especially in tropical countries, is a big issue. So and they know that mosquitoes live in these wetlands, so they're actually draining the wetlands, filling them in to eliminate the breeding ground for these insects. But obviously, by doing that, you're also destroying a reservoir of biodiversity that we've spoke about. So obviously, we want to stop doing this. So how do we preserve and restore wetlands? Well, only about 6% of the country's remaining inland wetlands are federally protected, and state and local wetland protection is inconsistent and generally weak. So here is the main concern, right? Only 6%. That means 94% are not protected, right? I always try to look at the other side of the coin here. 6% are protected. That means 94% aren't protected. Private investment bankers make money by buying wetland areas and restoring or upgrading them or creating new wetland. This creates wetland banks or credits that the bankers then sell to developers. However, it is difficult to restore, enhance, and create a wetland. So unfortunately, that's not really happening as much as you think it may. So, core case study. How do we restore the Florida Everglades, right? The Everglades, a huge wetland, basically encompassing most of the southern third of Florida. To help preserve the Everglades system, in 1947, the U.S. government established Everglades National Park. However, this protection effort did not work because of the massive water distribution and land development project to the north, all right? So to the north of the Everglades, they were having this massive water distribution and land development project, which basically didn't help protect the Everglades. The Everglades were protected, but north of the Everglades, they were doing all these things that unfortunately were still disturbing the Everglades. Much of the original Everglades has been drained, paved over, polluted by agricultural runoff, and invaded by a number of plant and animal species. So what you're looking at here is, all right, outline of the original Everglades system is in red here, okay? So this is where the original Everglades system was. You'll notice Everglades National Park here is in green, right? This area here is urban areas now. This is a water conservation area and an agricultural area. So what was happening is the project to the north of the Everglades, basically water comes out of Lake Okeechobee and feeds the Everglades. Well, they were taking that water, right? They were taking the water for the agricultural area, for the land development north of the Everglades. So even though the Everglades themselves, the national park here, was protected, unfortunately, to the north, they were taking the water from Lake Okeechobee, not allowing it to get into the Everglades, and that was causing issues. And then water that did get into the Everglades from the agricultural area obviously had fertilizer on it that was causing issues in the Everglades as well with eutrophication. So again, it was a good idea, but unfortunately it didn't work. And because of that, the Everglades biodiversity has been decreasing, mostly because of habitat loss, pollution, and invasive species. About 90% of the wading birds in Everglades National Park have vanished. In addition, populations of vertebrates from deer to turtles are down 75 to 95%. So unfortunately, not a great story there. So the world's largest ecological restoration project, known as the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, has been put into effect, and it has several ambitious goals. So first, restore the flow of the Kissimmee River. That's the river that comes out of Lake Okeechobee. Remove all canals and levees that block natural water flows south of Lake Okeechobee. Conversion of large areas of farmland into marshes. All right, so take these farmlands now and let's convert them back into marshes, into wetlands. Creation of 18 large reservoirs and underground water storage areas for the lower Everglades and South Florida's population. And building a canal reservoir system for catching the water now flowing out to sea and pumping it back into the Everglades to hopefully maintain the wetness, the wetlands of the Everglades. So again, just a study that kind of puts into account all the things we're talking about and how the folks in southern Florida, through this comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, trying to mitigate some of the issues that we've seen over the past century or so. All right, so now we're going to move on and in general talk about how we can sustain terrestrial biodiversity biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we basically talked about forests, we talked about grasslands and wetlands. All right, and now we're going to start talking about in general, how do we protect these things? So we need to establish and protect wilderness parks. We need to identify and protect biological hotspots. These are highly threatened areas of biodiversity, like tropical rainforests, like our wetlands. We need to protect the ecosystem services that these that our terrestrial systems provide us. We need to restore any damaged ecosystems, and we need to share areas that we dominate as human beings with other species. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, map the world's terrestrial ecosystems and create an inventory of species. Identify the resilient and fragile ecosystems out there. Then protect the most endangered ecosystems and species, with an emphasis on protecting plant biodiversity and the ecosystem services that are provided. We need to restore the degraded ecosystems and, again, provide incentives to landowners to not damage any more of the ecosystem. So here are some strategies, all right, for sustaining terrestrial biodiversity. Number one, protect species from extinction, right? We spoke about in a previous chapter that when creatures become extinct, unfortunately, that decreases biodiversity. It also decreases speciation, which can increase biodiversity. So we need to protect species from extinction. We need to set aside wilderness areas. We need to establish parks and nature preserves where people can interact with nature. We need to identify and protect the biodiversity hotspots. Again, we spoke about that already. Shift to new development to lands already cleared or degraded. Again, we spoke about that. And protect important ecosystem services. So you're noticing a lot of the things we've talked about. Again, you know, these are the steps that we need to take, and it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. A lot of times the steps are the same or very similar. Increase crop productivity on existing cropland. So instead of finding more cropland, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about sustainable agriculture in a couple of chapters, but don't find new cropland. Let's increase the crop productivity on the existing cropland. Rehabilitate and restore partially damaged ecosystems. And again, share areas we dominate with other species. So there are actually 34 biodiversity hotspots that have been established or at least located around the world. Only covers about 2% of Earth's surface, but 50% of flowering plant species and 42% of terrestrial vertebrates are found within these 34 biodiversity hotspots, which only cover 2% of the Earth. So again, these are hotspots because a lot of our biodiversity are in these 34 locations. There are also about 1.2 billion people in those 34 biodiversity hotspots. So now here you'll notice where the issue is coming, and only 5% of the total area in these hotspots is truly protected. Again, that means 95% of the area of these 34 biodiversity hotspots are not protected. So here we go. Here's a map of them. You'll notice where they are basically in red, okay, are what have been determined as biodiversity hotspots around the world. And again, these are the areas that we really need to hone in on and make sure we protect what's going on there. All right, so one way to do it is to establish wilderness areas. In 1964, the Wilderness Act was put in place here in the United States, and what that was the U.S. government setting aside undeveloped tracts of public land. However, only 5% of U.S. land is protected as wilderness, and more than half of it is actually in Alaska. Okay, so most of the lower 48 states not having any wilderness areas protected by the 1964 Wilderness Act, and that probably needs to change, right? As human population and ecological footprint expand, it's becoming increasingly difficult to establish new wilderness areas because, again, we're not having, human beings are basically touching all these areas and disturbing them. Wilderness areas are areas that have been undisturbed, they're undeveloped tracts of land, and unfortunately, undeveloped tracts of land are becoming few and far between, especially here in the U.S. So we could establish parks and other nature reserves. So more than 6,600 national parks in 120 countries have been established. However, most are too small to sustain large animal species, And some are so popular that humans are actually degrading them. So again, we use our natural parks, our national parks, right? We use them all the time, but unfortunately, we're using them so much, they're becoming so popular that we're degrading them. I always joke, I remember 20 years ago when I used to hike here in Harriman State Park when I was in my 20s, I would never see a person. I would hike with my buddies, and we would hike for hours, and we wouldn't see anyone. Now you go for a hike in Harriman State Park, and I always joke that I want to set up a Cinnabon stand right on the trail because there's so many people using all these trails now in Harriman State Park. And if you're not familiar with that, it's right across the river in Rockland County. So many people now using these trails that you can't even go hiking and have piece of nature, right? You're constantly passing people on the trail. Not necessarily a bad thing, but not necessarily a good thing either, because with so much human use, the park is being degraded. Parks in less developed countries do have the greatest diversity, but they're subject to illegal poaching, logging, mining, and other uses that unfortunately help, once again, to degrade those parks. The U.S. has 59 major national parks, but unfortunately, as I've been saying, there are stresses on our U.S. public parks. Factors that degrade them are popularity, what I just talked about, off-road vehicle use, right? ATVs, people love riding them. Well, you ride those ATVs in these parks, and unfortunately, you are degrading the parks. Cell phone towers, non-native species, right? Invasive species getting in there. Nearby air pollution and traffic could degrade the parks, and overdue maintenance and repairs. Unfortunately, a lot of times we have these parks, but we don't allocate enough money to maintain and repair the park, and so you have these overdue maintenance and repairs that also act to degrade the park. So, how do we design and manage our nature reserves to be able to adequately sustain our biodiversity? Well, large nature reserves typically sustain more species and provide greater habitat diversity than small reserves. All right, we need to establish something called habitat corridors that can benefit species. This allows migration in response to climate change. So remember, we talked about how deforestation fragments forests, where you once had a whole forest covering a whole area. Now you have maybe a forest here and a forest here. We need to get some corridor in there, that maybe a narrow stretch of forest that can allow species to migrate from one forest to the next forest, right? Because maybe these species can't migrate through roads or through condominium complexes, right? So we need to have these corridors, these habitat corridors, to be able to allow migration through these fragmented either forest or wetlands or grasslands, etc. We also need something known as the buffer zone concept. This is so basically in a buffer zone, you strictly protect the inner core of a reserve and then sustainably you extract resources in the buffer zone. So basically you make a circle in these preserves. The inner circle you strictly protect. There should be no off-road vehicles, no mining, no logging, nothing. And then outside that, you can have a buffer zone, which is still part of the natural reserve, but in the buffer zone, you will allow some sustainable resource extraction in that buffer zone. So some sustainable logging, right? Some sustainable mining, things like that in the buffer zone. So this is a concept. We're seeing it a little bit in Europe, and it looks like we're trying to bring this concept down here to the United States. All right, so Science Focus 10.1 talks about reintroducing the gray wolf to Yellowstone National Park. The number of gray wolves declined between 1850 and 1900, basically killed by humans because they were killing livestock. So the cattle ranchers didn't like these gray wolves around because they were killing their livestock, and so they killed the wolves, and they declined the number of them between those 50 years. In 1996, they relocated 41 gray wolves caught in Canada to Yellowstone. Then by 2014, 104 wolves in Yellowstone National Park. So again, this is a little bit of a positive, right? We have reintroduced the species. Here it is, the gray wolf right here. And by reintroducing the species, we are now beginning to see their numbers increase a little bit in Yellowstone National Park. All right, final one for this chapter. We're just going to for this part 2. We're just going to look at a case study in Costa Rica. Identifying and protecting biodiversity in Costa Rica. I think I said this previously, how Costa Rica is actually a leader sustaining biodiversity and other ecosystem services around the world. They are leaders in this. So Costa Rica protects a larger portion of its land than any other country. Principles of biodiversity that the Costa Rican government and the Costa Rican people believe in. They believe in respecting biodiversity and understanding the value of sustaining it. They rely less on fossil fuels and more on direct solar energy in Costa Rica, and they place a value on those ecosystem services, and they help implement full cost pricing in Costa Rica. So what they have is they have mega reserves, which are large conservation areas in the country. They're designed to sustain about 80% of the country's biodiversity in these mega reserves. And what they've done is they've used this buffer zone concept. They have a protective inner core surrounded by 2 buffer zones that local people can use. All right. So basically, the inner core totally protected. You have 1 buffer zone that is, less protected than the inner, but still has some protection. And then you even have a wider buffer zone that even has less protections on it. And again, local people can use those buffer zones. They have a large ecotourism industry in Costa Rica, and that is why they are leaders, because they know they're making a lot of money by people like us heading down there and enjoying the ecology of the area. And so they know they put a monetary money on that, or a value on that, right? A monetary value on this ecotourism, and they know they have to conserve their biodiversity if they want to make money, right? So unfortunately, a lot of stuff comes down to money, but again, they understand it, that biodiversity equals money, and so they are protecting it very well. So here, I'll leave you here. Again, this is Costa Rica's mega reserves. The green areas are protected natural parklands. The yellow areas are the buffer zones. So again, where you see green, strictly protected, you can't really do anything in there. The yellows are the buffer zones, where again, they do have some protection, but they do allow people to use that. So again, kind of using, this is kind of the win-win situation for everyone, protecting the biodiversity of Costa Rica by also allowing the people to use some of that biodiversity and some of those ecosystem services as well. Okay, so that's going to be the end of part 2 on my lecture on Chapter 10, Sustaining Terrestrial Biodiversity, Forest, Public Lands, Grasslands, Wetlands, and Cities. Again, one more part 3 to go. I look forward to seeing you there. And as always, thanks for listening.